Thanks, John. Hello, everyone. Like John mentioned, this is the NSP Closeout Overview webinar. So that's what we'll be covering today. My name is Taylor Edwards. I am a technical assistance provider with ICF. And me and my colleagues will be walking you through some of the NSP Closeout Overview content and updates today. So materials for this webinar have already been posted for this session. I will go ahead and drop that link in the chat box in just a second. Okey-doke. The webinar materials are posted on the HUD Exchange in the NSP training section 7 to 14 days after the live webinar. So you will see the recording of this webinar posted shortly. The presenters for today will be myself. Again, I'm Taylor Edwards. I'm a technical assistance provider with ICF. You have my colleague Onyi eBay here with ICF as well, and then Duncan Yetman from HUD will be joining us today. So our agenda today is we'll cover the NSP Closeout series. As many of you know, this is the first webinar in a series of NSP Closeout webinars. We'll then pass it to Duncan to give the HUD welcome. We'll go over some NSP background information, and then we'll go through our Closeout Crosswalk. You'll get a demonstration of where you can find that and what it is. And then we'll have our Closeout overview, and then we'll end this session with a Q&A. So like I mentioned before, this is the first session in the NSP Closeout series. Just to give you a brief introduction over this, throughout the entire series, we'll be covering updates to HUD requirements that grantees must follow to properly close out their NSP grants, the steps and special considerations grantees must work through to properly dispose of NSP-funded properties in a land bank, possible strategies grantees can use to determine what's the best use for their remaining NSP program income. And then, of course, we'll go over new tools and resources to help guide all NSP grantees through the closeout process. So like I mentioned before, this is the first topic of 3 that we'll be covering. In the NSP series, there will be a closeout overview, which, of course, you're on that webinar today. We encourage you to join us again on July 13th for the office hours related to NSP closeout. We will have NSP program income. That webinar is July 18th, and those office hours are on July 20th. We then will close out this series with NSP land bank closeout. That webinar is going to be on July 25th, and the office hours on July 27th. So as you can see here, we have both a webinar and office hours. We did this to help ensure grantees understand the closeout process with each topic. So right now you're on the webinar, but we do have office hours following each webinar for 60 minutes. So you have that opportunity to speak to us one-on-one about your NSP program and any questions you may be having. Webinar participants are automatically registered for the office hour sessions, so don't worry about that. While we will answer questions about overall NSP closeout process today during the webinar, we encourage grantees with more in-depth questions or specific questions related to your NSP program, DRGR, your closeout status, etc., to join us on July 13th from 1 to 2 p.m. Eastern. Like I said, during the office hour sessions, you will have more time to dive into your program-specific questions. And with that said, I will now hand over our presentation to Duncan Yetman from HUD to give the HUD welcome. Duncan?
Thank you. Thanks, Taylor. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Duncan Yetman. I'm the Deputy Director of the Entitlement Communities Division in the Office of Block Grant Assistance. And I'm very pleased to be able to welcome you today to the 2023 NSP Closeout webinar series. HUD is excited to be offering this webinar series as part of our continuing effort to provide technical assistance to our grantees looking to close out their NSP 1, NSP 2, and NSP 3 grants. The idea for this series began in particular with the issuance of the Community Development Block Grant Closeout Notice in December of 2022. This notice did tweak some things with the existing NSP closeout process. So we want today to first clearly explain what has changed and what has remained the same. We also see this webinar series as an opportunity to introduce new and existing grantee staff, especially with CDBG entitlement grantees, to the closeout process in general. CDBG entitlement grantees will soon need to be closing out their entitlement grants each year. We want to help them gain experience in closing out grants by encouraging them to close out their NSP grants. Once you follow the steps we lay out here today and close your NSP grant, we hope you will see and come to experience how easy and relatively painless the process is, and be less fearful of needing to close out your CDBG entitlement grant in the future. So I ask that you enjoy today's webinar, ask questions, and welcome again to NSP Closeouts.
Thank you, Duncan. So I will go ahead and give us some NSP background. Like Duncan said, there are some new folks here for NSP, but there are some seasoned people with NSP as well. So as many of you already know, the Neighborhood Stabilization Program grants were a form of emergency assistance launched in response to the 2008 financial crisis. These grants were intended to help struggling communities deal with the increase of abandoned and foreclosed homes, increase the supply of affordable housing, and restore neighborhood stability throughout the country. Many communities have used NSP to launch incredible programs. NSP has an enormous effect on communities, as you all probably know. It not only acted as a revitalization program for after the crisis, but NSP helps communities draw lessons learned and strategies to help neighborhoods truly stabilize, even after closing out their NSP grants. So I wanted to provide some of this data here to show you a snapshot of all the NSP grant funding going into these incredible projects and the status of these grants. So as you can see here, about 388 grantees received HUD funding across all NSP programs. That's including NSP 1, 2, and 3. These programs total about $6.8 billion. The average remaining grant balance among these NSP programs is less than 5%. I included a link on here for you guys to access the NSP Closeout Status Indicator Reports, which are available on the HUD Exchange. If you're interested on looking at this data for yourself and taking a deeper dive, these reports take the data in the DRGR system and provides viewers with a summary of data related to the closeout status of NSP grants across the country. These reports are updated quarterly. We have some additional data here. So as HUD is encouraging all grantees to move to closeout, we thought it would be helpful to give you a glimpse of the NSP grant status landscape. So to date, HUD has closed out 159 grants so far. There are 474 NSP grants that are yet to be closed. So we're looking at about 470 active grants and then 4 grants that are ready to close. Okay, now that we provided some background, we will now move on to some of the polling questions that my colleague John will launch for us. This is an opportunity to tell us about your personal NSP experience. This information we collect today will be helpful in tailoring this NSP closeout training as long as the the series. This will help us tailor our series to this audience as well. So the first question we have is, what experience do you have with NSP? So it doesn't matter where you are in the process right now. We kind of just want to understand where you are. So is it less than 1 year? Do you have 2 to 4 years? It could be 5 to 7 years, or you could be one of those folks that are 8+ years experienced with NSP. So we'll give some time for you guys to put in answers there. Okay, I see some answers are coming in. So it looks like we have, so we have a bunch of folks who are less than 1 year. So I'm glad you're here today where we can help you kind of understand the NSP closeout process. We have a couple folks that are, a little bit more seasoned. So thank you for filling that out. We have a couple other questions as well. So what NSP grant funding do you have? So you may have NSP1, NSP2, or NSP3, or it is okay if you're not sure. So you can just tell us, what kind of NSP grant are you dealing with right now? Okay. We have a lot of folks with NSP1. Yeah, it's looking like NSP1. We have a couple people with NSP2 and 3, but it looks like NSP1 is the bulk of this audience today. That's good to know. We'll move on to our last question here. So question number 3 is, are you ready to close out your NSP grant? It could be yes, it could be no, it could be unsure. All this information is helpful, and it's helpful to know, where you are today. Okay, I see some yeses. That's good. That's good news. I bet Duncan will be happy to hear that. There's some unsures, which is fine. Hopefully after this presentation, we'll be able to walk through and maybe you'll feel a little bit more, clear about where you are in that process. There's some no's, and this presentation is also for you. You can know what it takes before you actually move on to that closeout process. Okay. Well, we'll go ahead and close the polls. Thank you, John, so much. And thank you to the audience for responding. This is helpful information. And we'll now transition into our webinar and content and kind of go over our training goals here. So the goal of this training is to help grantees with closing out NSP grants, connecting the overall NSP closeout process with NSP program income and land bank. So we'll draw those connections and then review the changes to the NSP closeout process, as Duncan hinted to earlier. Okay, so before we move on, we wanted to kind of give you a demonstration of what the NSP closeout crosswalk looks like. The NSP Crosswalk is available on the HUD Exchange. The Crosswalk is an easy-to-use tool to help NSP grantees identify the changes to the NSP closeout process and understand how they can move towards closing out their NSP grants. So I'm going to share my screen and kind of give us a demonstration of that crosswalk here. So as you can see here, we're on the HUD Exchange, which I'm sure all of you or most of you are familiar with at this point. How you'll get to the NSP page is that you'll press Programs, and we're looking for NSP today. So you'll see we'll select NSP. You'll then be brought to the NSP landing page. And as HUD is encouraging folks to close out their grants, we thought it was a great idea to feature some of this closeout information here. So you'll see there's more than just the crosswalk. There's the guide, some checklists, but we really want to focus on the crosswalk today. So you'll click this View the Crosswalk. You'll then be brought to an abstract page where you can see the description of the crosswalk, and then you'll have a link to the crosswalk here. My intention for this demonstration today is kind of just help you orientate yourself with, okay, how do I use this tool as a quick reference to navigate the NSP crosswalk and NSP closeout? So here's the NSP crosswalk. There's some additional links here that you can use to supplement your knowledge if you have any other questions about NSP. And I'll just go through this very quickly on how you can use this and how it's intended for you to, understand where you are and what you need to be aware of as far as the NSP closeout guidelines. So on our far left column here, this outlines the steps you should consider when you're closing out your NSP grant. So you'll see here that we have step 1, which is determining the readiness for closeout. Step 2, which is closeout criteria. You have grantee submission as step 3. We touch on bulk closeouts. We touch on step 4, which is the HUD review process. And then step 5, which is those post-closeout requirements. The middle column here lays out the previous guidance before Notice CPD-22-14 was published in December 2022. So as a HUD grantee, an NSP grantee, you're probably familiar with this middle section. It has all that information about closing out pertaining to each step here. And then on the far right side here, we have the changes to these guidances from Notice CPD-22-14. So if you look here, it says no change. We notated that there's no change. Therefore, you can adhere to the previous guidance on NSP closeout. In sections where you don't see no change, we note what changed and what you should be aware of. And so that is kind of how you should navigate this tool. Anything in red is something you should pay close attention to. These are probably what you would consider, moderate changes that you may not be used to and would be helpful for you when you're looking to close out. So that is going to be the NSP Closeout Crosswalk. I know I didn't go into the details of the crosswalk, but that's what my colleague Onyi is going to cover today in our presentation. He's going to go over the content of that crosswalk, but also closing out your NSP grant. So with that being said, I'll go ahead and pass this presentation over to Onyi.
Hello, everyone. My name is Onyeibe, and I'm a former HUD grantee myself. I have experience with DRGR, worked a little bit with NSP. So like you all, I have worked federal grants and have been in your shoes. So hopefully I can provide some guidance today around closing out on NSP. As Taylor and Duncan mentioned, is this still going in and out, the audio? Can you guys hear me? Okay, I'm gonna try to see, hopefully it's working. Okay, so as Taylor and Duncan mentioned, today's session is gonna be very important because we really do wanna encourage folks to close out on their NSP grant. If you guys are aware, we got the new notice that was issued last December 8th, last year. You may have not had time to read through that notice and digest all the different things that have changed. So that's why this session today is going to be really important to go over those details. And again, we encourage you guys to ask questions at the end and also bring specific cases that you guys may be struggling with to the office hours so we can help you guys, if you guys are ready to close out, be able to do that efficiently and make it as straightforward as possible. As Taylor mentioned as well, there's a lot of resources that are available to you guys. There will be the office hours after this webinar. And also, just want to reiterate, you guys can work with your CPD field office representatives to address any other issues that might arise as you guys try to go through the closeout process. All right, so the first step in doing closeout is determining whether or not you guys can actually close out, right? Typically, the HUD Office of the Block Grant Assistance, they would review what's happening in the DRGR system and identify which NSP grants or grantees are potentially ready for closeout. But it's not always, a requirement that we need to wait for HUD to initiate that, right? If you read the notice, grantees and the CPD field offices may also identify grants that are potentially ready for closeout. And that's always going to be happening on an ongoing basis, right? So, you guys can be doing the due diligence as well, reviewing what's been entered into DRGR reviewing what's in your internal systems and tracking your progress in terms of drawing down from your locks balances in order to determine have we met the stated goals of the grant, have we met our requirements, and if we have done so, can we actually start to submit the closeout documentation for our NSP grant, regardless of whether HUD has identified the grant as ready for closeout. So that's going to be the first step, and nothing has changed between the new notice and the old notice in terms of that. The next step is going to be the closeout criteria, right? So there are going to be four main things that we typically want to be looking at. The first one being, have we actually completed our activities? So obviously with the NSP funding, we funded a variety of programs or projects. We want to be checking to see if the work that was to be assisted with NSP funding has actually been completed and has it met a national objective, right? The next thing we want to be looking at are, with the NSP funds, have we incurred all the costs that we said we're going to incur, and have we actually drawn down and reimbursed those costs in totality, right? We want to be thinking about things predominantly related to the programmatic costs, and this would not necessarily include the costs related to closeout, so we're not talking specifically about audits or any other contract disputes that might be happening related to your programs. But we want to make sure that all your activities are completed and that we have paid and drawn everything related to those activities. The third thing that we want to be thinking about is your 25% set aside requirements. You guys should be well aware of that. But again, this is just making sure that you've expended all the funds to house individuals or families whose incomes, did not exceed the 50% area median income. So again, making sure that through your data that's been collected, that we've met this requirement and we can document that we've done so. And then lastly, we want to make sure that for the grant agreements that we've signed for NSP, that we have met all the responsibilities and requirements under the grant agreements. Make sure that there's no regulations that we're missing or anything in terms of performance that we have not completed, right? So these are all the things we want to consider when we're talking about our closeout criteria. Okay. Sorry, I'm gonna go off video for a second. For the grantee submission, there is a major change here, and I want to talk through. So if you guys remember, when you guys are submitting your closeout documentation, there's a variety of documentation that HUD typically requires, right? HUD is going to require grantees to submit their closeout certification and agreement, the NSP management plan, the inventory of any real property and equipment, and the land bank plan. If you guys have read through the previous notice, there was also the requirement to submit the closeout checklist. The new notice sort of removes that requirement and makes it more of an optional requirement. So you can submit it if you want to, but rather what we are expecting is that grantees may or may not choose to still use it as a tool to support the review of all their documentation, to make sure that they are submitting all the right documentation and that they've reviewed their grants information in DRGR to make sure that they've met all the requirements for closeout. But you're not required to necessarily submit it to HUD. In addition to the financial and performance aspects of closing out the grant, we also want to reiterate that when closing the grant, especially with any remaining balances, you also want to be using this form, the form HUD 7082, to identify if there's any possible recapture of unspent grant funds and whether or not we need to deobligate those unspent grant funds as well. In addition to these documentation, you'll see on the list, we also want to make sure that we're submitting the final performance and evaluation report through DRGR. When you guys are submitting your complete documentation, submitting the documentation with your completed certification as well. So again, just to reiterate, the only change here is that the closeout checklist is not mandatory, but is optional. And again, just encouraging everyone, you can use it as a tool to make sure that you have everything in order before submitting the documentation to HUD, right? If you guys have submitted documentation or will do so, and there are issues with what was submitted, the HUD office should work with you guys to notify you in writing what it is that's missing and request the necessary documentation to be submitted in order to officially start the closeout process as well. All right, so another major thing here that we want to talk through is this concept of bulk closeout. So previously, grantees were required to submit a separate closeout agreement package for each NSP grant. The new notice, however, allows grantees to be able to certify for multiple grants and actually use a single closeout agreement to close out multiple NSP grants. And essentially the way this would look is you can attach all the documentation for each grant and reference the lists of grants in the closeout agreement that you're actually trying to close out, okay? This, again, is essentially to try to help streamline and make it a little bit easier for grantees to be able to close out if you guys have multiple grants. One thing that we want to caution or just be clear about is that when we're talking about bulk closeouts, we are talking about closing out within the same grant program. So for example, NSP is a grant program. So you can close out, for example, NSP and NSP3 in the same closeout agreement package. You don't want to necessarily combine NSP with the closeout of another grant program, okay? So just be aware of that when we're talking about bulk closeouts. And again, in the context of this whole series, we want grantees to be using or be thinking about this moment as the right opportunity to close out grants and using this bulk closeout as a method if possible to really streamline, our ability to close out all these grants hopefully efficiently. Okay. So once we've submitted the documentation to HUD, obviously HUD is going to review and make sure that everything is in order, not only in the package, but what the information that's being reported through DRGR, right? So the grant is going to close on the date that the HUD executes the closeout agreement. And the way that process is going to work is that the CPD field office will forward the closeout agreement and the form HUD 7082 that we mentioned to the HUD Accounting Center. The HUD Accounting Center will cancel any unused portion of the grant. And then the CPD field office will retain for its own records the final SF425, the final performance and expenditure report, and a copy of the closeout agreement. And I believe we want to allow HUD no more than a year to be able to close out or to complete all the closeout actions on their end after the official end of the period of performance. Okay. So again, as you can see in the slide, once HUD has done their review, they're going to go forward and execute the closeout agreement. And again, there's no major change here from the previous process, but just wanted to reiterate what the order of operations there is. And then here we have some specific post-closeout requirements that we want to make everyone aware of. When it comes to audits and monitoring, no major change per se from what the previous notice said. When we're talking about audits and monitoring, just remember this includes things like single audits. The new notice now specifically includes program-specific audits. And for anyone that's not aware of what the distinction is, when we're talking about single audits, we're talking about the audit of a grantee or an entity's financial statements that includes all its federal awards. When we're talking about the program-specific audits, we're talking about an audit that's specific to one grant program, for example, NSP. So again, if you read through the notice, we are encouraging folks before we close out to ensure that they've done a complete review and there's no outstanding audits or monitoring letters or monitoring findings that are out there that needs to be resolved with regard to the NSP program. If there are, then we want to make sure that we take the appropriate steps to resolve those findings before we actually move forward with the closeout process. So just be aware that the only update here is that we're now including any program-specific audits. When it comes to record keeping, no major change here, but want to reiterate that grantees can retain all their documents or should retain all their documents for 5 years after closeout of the grant to ensure that all applicable record retention requirements are met. All right. Here we're going to get into real property and equipment. The major change here is that HUD no longer requires, again, the NSP closeout checklist to be submitted, but everything else on the list is required. And this goes back to the prior slides where we talk about that list of stuff that we want to get into HUD. One thing I did want to call out here is that for some grantees, you may or may not have issues with the module in DRGR that allows you to enter addresses or specific addresses, which when I say that, meaning that we are noting which addresses were assisted with NSP dollars. Just work with HUD on any issues that may arise, but also we wanted to make it known that it is important that the inventory of real property and equipment submitted with the closeout package should align or corroborate with what was eventually entered into DRGR. So just want to make sure that whatever you're submitting to HUD in your, whether it's a backup Excel file, make sure it does align with what was actually entered into DRGR. If there are mismatches or any data discrepancies, just make sure you're working with your HUD field office to understand what's going on there. And if you do need support with getting that information accurate into DRGR, just reach out for TA. For program income, no major change here. We do intend to have the next session cover in more detail strategies around how to deal with program income and balances of program income. So look forward to that next session to get into that a little bit more. And then lastly, the remaining post-closeout requirements here, we have the 25% set aside. So I had mentioned earlier, there's no change here. We still want to make sure that we're hitting this target. And again, for the 25% set aside, just trying to make sure that we've used our funding of the grant plus any program income to house individuals that are at or below 50% AMI. For land banks, no change. We still need to make sure that any property held in a land bank at the time of grant closeout is subject to any future monitoring for compliance within the 10-year time limit requirement, right? And that 10-year begins at the date of the grant closeout. For the loan loss reserves, no change here. And again, if you guys are not aware, this is in situations where grantees may have had fewer loan defaults than what your original methodology had estimated. So if you do have additional loss reserves that were never used to cover those defaulted loans, the remaining funds would be considered NSP funds and then would be used in accordance with the NSP requirements for the initial grant funds, right? So a lot of these requirements still remain the same as before. And I believe potentially the third session will get into more details around land banks and loan loss reserves. Right? So that covers it. Again, there are some important changes around what needs to be submitted to HUD and potentially new forms to be used. And then also the bulk closeouts, right? But for the most part, the closeout process is very straightforward and is really intended to sort of build a little bit more efficiency and streamline to the process to enable you guys to be able to close out. Any questions you have, please be sure to ask for support if needed. And then just to get into tools and resources, there's a lot of information out there. In addition to the new notice, CPD-22-14, we still have the prior notices that are still applicable, whether we have the notices pertaining to program income or clarifying the QPR requirements. You can also reference back to the old closeout guide for more specifics and details around some of the post-closeout requirements that I mentioned. And then lastly, for a lot of grantees, if you guys go to the NSP website that Taylor went over, we do have the reports being published, I believe, monthly around where different grantees are financially in terms of your balance of your locks funds and your program income, and also a closeout status indicator report that would be very helpful for folks to know where they are. All right. And again, lastly, if you guys do need additional support or assistance, be sure to request on-call TA from HUD. And you guys can make those formal requests in the HUD Exchange at the Request Program Assistance page on the website. All right, I'm going to pass it back to Taylor.
Thanks, Onyi. At this time, everyone, we're going to move into our question and answer section. So if you do have any outstanding questions, please put them into the Q&A box. And I'm actually going to invite my colleague, Jamie Abbott. She's also from ICF. She has experience closing out NSP grantee grants. And I'm going to invite her on to answer some questions and kind of share her experience and her wealth of knowledge that she has with everyone. So, Jamie?
Thank you, Taylor. Hi, everyone. My name is Jamie Abbott, and I am with ICF, but my prior experience was with the state of Missouri Community Development Block Grant Program, and also I worked with the Jefferson City, Missouri, which is an entitlement program, and I actually successfully closed out the city's NSP program with the state of Missouri. So I'm here to help answer any questions that you may have with NSP. So one of the first questions that we're going to address is, when should grantees start thinking about closing out? And I'm here to say that all grantees need to be thinking about what actions they need to be taking to get to closeout status. So that may involve contacting your local CPD rep to initiate that conversation, to identify the steps to get to closeout, what actions that would need to be taken. And also the HUD Exchange website has a great resource on guidance and policies and procedures that would need to be taken to get to closeout. And we can insert that link into the chat, and it's also notated on the tools and resources page that was previously displayed. So one of the first questions that had been submitted was, we still have a balance in our line of credit, but we have a few projects in the pipeline. Is there a hard deadline to close out NSP grants? So the response is that there is no hard deadline to close out the NSP grants, but there are grantees with remaining dollars amounts in the lock system for which they may be unable to effectively implement a project. Please contact your local field office for a discussion about a projected closeout date. Another question that came in is land banks for states subrecipients would be a 10 years from the subrecipient closeout on their contract with the state. Correct. Not after the state closes with HUD. So clarification here is when the state closes their NSP grant with HUD, the 10-year period for the land bank properties begins or starts with the date of the fully executed closeout agreement with HUD. Okay, another question that came in is the closeout instructions have attachments under step 2. How do you access the printable version of the forms? So the Taylor had demonstrated earlier how to access the Closeout Crosswalk on the HUD Exchange, and those links within the forms on the HUD Exchange itself should be live and be able to click there. And that link was also provided within the chat earlier in this discussion. And Duncan,
Yeah,
would you like to go ahead and jump in?
I wanted to chime in on that one, Jamie, if I could. Some of those links are web forms. They're not PDFs. They're not Word documents. You can go to the closeout guide, and in the back of the closeout guide, you'll find printable versions of all of the closeout documents that you'll need.
Great, thank you, Duncan. Okay. So we have another question about remaining funds. So if moving funds from the NSP program to add them to the CDBG program, will those funds be included in the annual calculation for timeliness? And I want to say that yes, that is something that we're going to be covering in our next webinar about program income. But the short answer is that is it's something to consider on the timing of transferring your program income funds over to CDBG. So please tune in for the webinar next week covering program income closeout requirements. Okay, another question here is, are reports submitted to DRGR? So the NSP program at this time is DRGR is utilized for reporting purposes. So we'll need to, as part of the closeout process, we'll need to go ahead and make sure that as a grantee is up to date on all of the quarterly performance reports. And if not, the NSP guidance and process guidelines website does have a section on how to address getting up to date on your quarterly performance reports. Okay, another question here. What should TA providers be thinking about? Excuse me, I apologize here. What should TA providers be thinking about NSP closeout? Any recommendations on next steps? So in general, whether you're a TA provider or an NSP grantee, I think the in helping any NSP grantees getting to close out, the first step is the NSP grantee will need to take stock as to what is the status of their current grant. If there's a balance in their locks account, if there is program income that needs to be expended down, what items, if there's any projects in the queue, any land bank properties, and have the conversation with their local HUD CPD office to discuss the expectations and timeliness of getting to close out. Once again, there is no hard, fast date to close out the NSP grant, but HUD is encouraging everyone to look forward to closing out the program in the near future. Okay. All right, so there's a more complex question here, Duncan, that I may need your assistance on.
Sure.
So if the end use of a NSP assisted property now qualifies as part of the 25% set aside, can that project funding be changed to the set aside activity? Do budgets have to be made first?
Right.
So
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, your final accounting, if you will, for meeting that set aside requirement is going to be in your closeout certification, and you're going to get the final closeout certification. HUD is going to execute that and send that to you. If you need to adjust your final QPR based upon the current use of that property that now meets the set aside, by all means, go ahead and do that. And be sure that that is reflected in your final QPR. And that's perfectly fine. There's no budget change that needs to be made prior to that. You can just note that you exceeded your projection, for meeting the set aside requirement.
thank you for that, Duncan.
Sure.
Yeah, so another question about the 25% of set aside, does that include the current PI balance? So my understanding is that the LH25 requirement has to be met for the actual grant itself and for the program income balance itself too. So there's two separate measurements that will be taken for the LH25 requirement. Okay, there's another question about receiving DRGR technical assistance. So the grantee had received DRGR TA but ran out of hours. Who should we be reaching out to for an extension? Thank you. So there is the ability to request technical assistance on the HUD Exchange website. We can provide the link here shortly where you can take a look into requesting technical assistance. Thank you, Taylor. So to request program assistance, would submit your request to the program assistance page. It would require having a sign-in or a login ID, and make sure to include all the information around the program and the reasons for needing the technical assistance. And once submitted, HUD will review the request and provide a response.
And I would encourage you as well to contact your local HUD field office and alert them to the situation so that they can work through their channels and address that need for an extension as well.
Great. Great point there, Duncan. And we are getting all kinds of questions coming in. So if I'm unable to answer your questions live, I do want to note that we will make an effort to answer the questions during our office hours being held on July 13th. So make sure to attend the office hours because your question may be the same question that the other grantees are asking. So please make sure to join us at that time. And Taylor, I'm going to go ahead and turn it back over to you.
Sounds good. Thank you, Jamie. So I just wanted to cover some of the upcoming trainings that all our presenters have kind of hinted at. I covered earlier. I really want to stress that if you did not get your question answered, or if it is a more in-depth question about your specific NSP program, please come to the July 13th office hours. Those office hours will take place from 1 to 2 p.m. Eastern. And because you are registered for this webinar, you are registered for the office hours. So we really encourage you to come. Outside of NSP Closeout, we will have additional NSP related webinars within our series. So we have NSP Program Income Closeout, which that training webinar is going to be on July 18th, and your office hours are going to be on July 20th. We encourage you to come to those. And then we will close out this series with NSP Land Bank Closeout. That training webinar will take place on July 25th, and the office hours will take place on July 27th. So we encourage all of you here. I see that there are a couple of questions about program income, a couple of questions about land bank. We really encourage you to go to those specific sessions as well to really learn about that closeout process. And then we have some contact information here, so you can always find us on the HUD Exchange under the Neighborhood Stabilization Program page, which I demoed a little earlier. You can always contact your CPD representative, and we really do encourage this. And you can email us at nsp-questions@hud.gov. And with that being said, that concludes our webinar. I want to thank everyone for attending. You had so many great questions. If you didn't get your question answered, I really want to stress the July 13th office hours. We'll be working one-on-one with folks. We can talk about program-specific instructions for closeout and more in-depth. So thank you for your participation in the polls and putting in your questions. And we hope to see you on July 13th and at the rest of our webinar series. So thank you.